go through the website a little bit. I know we have a few people here for the first time, so we'll do a bit of an introduction to the IRP process as well. Can everyone see the presentation fine and hear me fine?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so we'll do introductions real quick before we kick things off. My name is Brian Robertson. I'm the manager of supply resource planning for Cascade, and my main job function is to manage the IRP process, which includes working with a lot of different departments within the company to come up with a company plan for the future. I want to do introductions for the rest of the resource planning group first. That way we can recognize that group that puts a lot of work and effort into this IRP process. So first off, we have Ginny DeBoer. If you want to hop on and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. My name's Jenny DeBoer. I'm a resource planning economist under Brian. I do a lot with the PGA, hedging program, and anything else IRP related.
Thanks, Ginny. And then we have Bailey Steves.
Hi, I'm Bailey Steves. I'm also an economist on the resource planning team under Brian as well.
And then we have Ryan Denton as well.
Hello, I'm Ryan. I'm the team under Brian. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I think you cut out a little bit there. Yeah, Ryan is the newest member of our team. It started, I think, about 2 months ago. So welcome, Ryan. Now I'll just go down the list in alphabetical order and have people introduce themselves. Please let us know your name and your title and the company you represent as well. Jody.
Hello, my name is Jody Albert. I'm the economic analyst for Cascade Natural Gas.
Thanks, Jody. Alessandra.
Hi, good morning. Alessandra, Policy Associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition.
Thank you. Bruce.
Good morning, Bruce Folsom. I'm a consultant for Cascade Natural Gas.
Thanks, Bruce. Kathleen.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'm Kathleen Campbell. I'm a senior engineer in engineering services.
Thank you. Michael Frills. Okay, and Michael, if you're there, you might be on mute. Yeah, I believe I'll come back to Michael, but I believe he's with the Oregon Department of Energy. Mason Freed.
Yeah, hi, Mason Freed. I'm a climate scientist at ICF, working with Cascade.
Thanks, Mason. Byron.
Morning. My name is Byron Harmon. I'm a regulatory analyst for the Washington UTC.
Thank you. Becky.
Good morning. Whoa.
Morning, Becky.
Oh, there was another BH on the screen and the microphone didn't go on to unmute. But good morning, I'm Becky Hodges. I'm with Cascade. I put together the 5-year plan and for budgeting and forecasting.
Thanks, Becky. Megan.
Hi, good morning. I'm Megan Kelzer, and I'm an environmental specialist for Cascade.
All right, Devin.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name's Devin McReel. I'm a proud alumni of the resource planning team and currently the renewable resources manager with Cascade.
Thank you. Michael Myers.
Yeah, good morning. Michael Myers, macroeconomist at Northwest Natural and part of the IRP team here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Shauna.
I'm Shauna Nira, and I'm an environmental specialist for Cascade.
Thank you. Russ. Russ, if you are there, we cannot hear you. I see you're unmuted.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. Good morning. Russ Nishikawa, Engineering Services Manager for the Montana Dakota Utilities Groups.
Thanks, Russ. Mike Parvin.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Mike Parvinen with Cascade's regulatory team.
Thanks, Mike. Patrick Hanks.
Hi, this is Patrick Hanks with the Building Industry Association of Washington.
Thanks. Caleb.
Yeah, everyone. Caleb Rammer, Program Manager for Cascade's Energy Efficiency Programs.
Thanks, Caleb. Chris, he's here not in the office with me.
I'll just move over to you. Good morning. I'm Chris Robbins, and I'm the Director of Gas Supply for Cascade.
Perfect. Thank you. Robert McLeod.
Hi, I'm Robert McLeod. I am a business agent for Labor's Local 292. Our members perform a lot of work on Cascade and MDU lines.
Thank you. Mark.
Good morning. I'm Mark Sellers Vaughn, Upstream Resources Special Manager with Cascade.
Thanks, Mark. Eric.
Yeah, good morning. This is Eric Wood. I'm Manager of Gas Supply for Cascade.
Sorry, Eric Sherman.
Senior Utility Analyst at Oregon PUC staff.
Thank you. Zach.
Yep, Zach Sowards with Engineering Services for the Montana Dakota Utilities Group.
Perfect. Carolyn.
Carolyn Stone, Gas Supply Analyst, Cascade.
Thank you. Quinn.
Quinn Weber, Regulatory Analyst with Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission.
And then Will.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Will Gerke, Senior Technical Analyst with the Northwest Energy Coalition.
Great, thank you, everyone. Is there anyone that I missed or joined while we were doing this? Introductions? I don't see any new names, so. Okay. All right, so going through the agenda real quick, we'll have a quick safety moment, and then I'll discuss Cascade Natural Gas, give a little bit of information about us. The purpose of the IRP, I'll go through the IRP webpage, that way people can get familiar with it. We'll discuss stakeholder engagement document, and then we'll have ICF jump in and give a presentation on climate weather data. I'll do a presentation on the demand and customer forecast. Bailey will jump in and do a regional market outlook presentation and avoided cost. And then Eric Wood will give a presentation on upstream pipeline presentations. I'll cap it off discussing plan scenarios and sensitivities. And then we'll open it up for feedback from external groups, for anyone actually, on the IRP process and some of the inputs and results. And then we'll discuss the 2025 IRP timeline and next steps. So anyone who's not familiar with this process or needs a refresher, feel free to jump in at any moment. You don't have to wait for the feedback slide to provide feedback or ask questions. You can either raise your hand, you can jump in and unmute yourself and interrupt me. This is an informal meeting. It's supposed to stir conversation about topics of the IRP of the company. So feel free to jump in at any moment. So we like to start off with safety moments during our presentations. This one is on pedestrian safety. I know that a lot of schools are going back into place. So make sure you're always looking out for pedestrians, especially near school zones, keeping an eye out for small children. Make sure you reduce your speed during inclement weather. Be prepared to stop for pedestrians when approaching crosswalks. Make sure you check for pedestrians, bikers, anything like that before you turn. And then try not to block paths like crosswalks or intersections. And then make sure you're just keeping an eye out for pedestrians when pulling out of like parking spaces or parking lots if they're walking on the sidewalk. And then always try to please avoid distracted driving. Put the phones down. Those things can wait. And then tips for pedestrians. So if you're the one walking, make sure you try to use the sidewalks when available. Look both ways before crossing. Only cross at marked crosswalks or intersections. And then make sure you obey traffic signals. And then keep an eye out on vehicles. Sometimes they may not see you, so it's better for you to keep an eye out on them. They'll do a lot more damage to the pedestrian than you'll do to the car. So you'll want to keep an eye out for vehicles, and then obviously avoid distracted walking as well. Okay. So a little bit of a history lesson for those who are not familiar with Cascade. Back in 1955, natural gas was virtually unheard of. Three gentlemen led a group of associates to form Cascade Natural Gas, which was incorporated in 1953. Back in 2007, Cascade was acquired by MDU Resources, which is headquartered in Bismarck. And MDU was founded in 1924 as an electric utility. And then the core businesses are gas and electric utilities and pipeline. There's a lot of employees across a lot of states. So MDU is very familiar with the different policies and planning around different states and things like that. And then there's 4 utilities across 8 states. Obviously MDU, Great Plains, Cascade Natural Gas, and then Intermountain, which is located in Idaho. So what does Cascade look like today? Cascade serves more than 316,000 customers across 95 communities, 67 of those in Washington, 28 in Oregon. As you can see by the map, there's a wide spread of Cascade customers. So Cascade's customer base is non-contiguous. We are connected through large natural gas pipelines, upstream pipelines with Northwest Pipe, GTN. You'll hear more about those pipelines during Eric's presentation. But you can see we have a heavy concentration in Western Washington and then Central Washington, and then Northern Oregon, Central Oregon, and then Eastern Oregon as well. It covers more than 32,000 square miles and 700 highway miles from one end of the system to the other. And in the production areas, mainly from the Rockies and then Western Canada area. And Eric will give more information about a lot of that information as well. So the purpose of the IRP, obviously there's the IRP guidelines. If people are not familiar with those, I would recommend going and looking at the WAC 480-90-238. Those are the IRP guidelines in Washington. We also have IRP guidelines in Oregon as well, but this IRP is focused on Washington. Cascade's basic philosophy is long-term resource planning and to guide the company's acquisition process consistent with the regulatory requirements of the state. Input, we like to do these technical advisory group meetings to get input from various perspectives from different industries, different folks. All of that information helps give a broader perspective to Cascade. And then as the scope continues to expand, we're committed to securing and supporting the appropriate internal and external resources to put together these integrated resource plans. There will be a lot of focus on the IRP for low carbon alternative fuels, meeting carbon compliance goals. Those are new to the IRP last year and expanding on those in this year's IRP. So you'll hear a lot of discussion about that. The goal is to make sure we have a least cost, least risk acquisition plan for our customers moving forward. So the IRP webpage, I'm going to actually close out of this and I'm going to pop into our IRP webpage. So here's our IRP webpage. This kind of talks about who can join. Anybody can join. Please reach out to me if you'd like to be on. And I'm speaking to everyone on this call, but also anyone who watches this recording. If you are interested in this IRP, please contact me. Reach out to me, and I can get you added to the distribution list. But this kind of explains what, who, how it works, what to expect, how to sign up, any accommodations. We also include a stakeholder engagement design document, which is the next portion of this presentation. There's a Spanish version of it. You on this website, if you speak Spanish, you can change this to Spanish. You can also change it to, I think there's several different languages you can choose here. We've had targeted tag meetings, 8 of them so far, that focus on different aspects of the IRP. If you are interested in any or all of these, feel free to watch the recording back. They're all posted here. You can also review the minutes and you can review the actual presentation itself. We also include the rest of the tag process, the timeline here. And then we'll also be including tag documents, important documents here. And then you could also review old IRP plans here as well. Okay, so I'm going to jump into back to the presentation real quick. Sorry, my okay. So we do include a stakeholder engagement document. So if you plan on participating in these technical advisory groups, I do recommend reviewing the stakeholder engagement document. It kind of outlines the process, what we expect from our stakeholders, what the stakeholders can expect from us, and so on and so forth. So I highly recommend reviewing that. Please let us know if you have any thoughts, any edits, any comments, anything like that. Okay. Sorry, I'm struggling with my computer this morning. Okay, so I'm gonna hand this over. If there's no questions about the IRP process, what it all entails, I'm going to hand this over to Mason.
Hey, thanks, Brian. So yeah, I just want to run through several slides here that describe how we're working together on incorporating and considering climate change with Cascade and for the IRP process. So to do that, just a bit of background, right? To do that, we're relying on global climate models, right? And these are the go-to, right, source for future climate information. These models simulate Earth's future climate and physical processes. In addition to those models, there's a process called downscaling, whereby we can translate the global climate data to a higher spatial resolution, and this is very helpful in better capturing local climate characteristics to improve planning. And all of our work together has taken a probabilistic approach. So we're not using a single model, right? We're using an ensemble or a larger number of models to better capture a fuller range of potential future climate conditions. And moving to the next slide, if you will, Brian. Just wanted to give an overview of the future climate scenarios that we are considering. So the climate projections that Cascade has developed use multiple future greenhouse gas emissions scenarios, and again, that larger ensemble of global climate models to account for uncertainty both in the pace of future greenhouse gas emissions and also the climate response to those emissions. So on the emission scenario side, together we're using the most recent climate projections that leverage shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs for short. These are the new emissions pathways that were used in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assessment that came out a year and a half or so ago. So they're up to date, and we're focusing on, again, two SSPs or two emission scenarios in particular. We're looking at SSP 245, which represents a more likely emission scenario that assumes meaningful greenhouse gas emissions reductions by mid-century. And we're also using a higher end SSP 370 scenario that represents a less likely future that assumes greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase through this century. And the figure on the right we just took from a recent paper in Nature that describes these SSPs, these emission scenarios, and assigns the relative likelihood of them based on current emissions trajectories and policies that have been put into place or pledged. Okay, going to the next slide. Just one more slide here on methods before we look at some of the some outputs. To do this work, right, so we're using those SSPs and Cascade is leveraging a particular downscaled climate product called Localized Constructed Analogs version 2, a mouthful for sure. We call it LOCA 2 for short. And these are downscaled, this data set provides downscale temperature projections to develop custom heating degree day projections for weather stations across Cascade's service area. And LOCA 2 is a great data set to use for this purpose for a number of reasons. It's a great downscale data set. And it's also peer reviewed, right, and industry vetted, and has been used in landmark climate assessments, very recent assessments, including the federal fifth national climate assessment that came out just last year. So wanted to make sure that we're using vetted, peer-reviewed data that's common across the country. This data set has an ensemble, as I mentioned, of 22 of these downscaled models between the two SSPs we're looking at that I just described in the last slide, and it downscales projections to a approximately 6 kilometer resolution grid across the service area. As a final step in the methodology, we paired these LOCA 2 projections with observational time series at the weather stations across the service area to do just a bit more bias correction, right? So that we're making sure that the LOCA 2 data set as best as possible can reproduce, right, the statistics of observed weather and climate at each weather station location. Okay, and then on the next slide, so given all that, right, here's some initial outputs and results. So these are these heating degree day projections. Folks are going to look at the figures on the bottom here just to tell you briefly what these figures are showing. These are the our annual time series of system weighted, aggregated across all the weather stations in the service area, time series of annual projected heating degree days. Okay, and there's two panels. The one on the left is for the more likely SSP 245 emission scenario, and the one on the right is for the less likely SSP 370 scenario. And the different colored lines from blue to gray represent the different quantiles from 0 to 1 for all of the models for those two SSPs. So it's just showing the range, right? The quantiles within that larger model ensemble. We're not showing all 22 models here, right? Just the quantiles. And so back up to the bullets, what we can see from figures like this, right, is that the projections show for both SSPs the potential for decreases, right, in HDDs across the service area. For the time period here, we're looking at 2025 next year through 2064. The less likely and warmer, right, SSP 370 ensemble has more agreement on the potential for decreases in HDDs than in the SSP 245 ensemble. And finally, when you look at these kinds of time series, right, we see that there's, under both scenarios, right, under both SSPs, there is significant interannual variability, right, ups and downs year to year, with some models representing cooler climate features than other models, and in this kind of interannual variability, right, we would expect, I mean, we all live this year to year, even, on top of this warming signal. Then we have one more slide that we can go to, and just wanted to note as a way to complement or augment the climate projection data that I just walked through, we've also done a more qualitative literature review on the potential for cold weather, right, in the service area in the Pacific Northwest more generally. The projections that I was just speaking to, are best available, right, and peer reviewed, but sometimes they have a hard time resolving important extreme events like polar vortex induced cold snaps and the like. So to address those kinds of things, we did a little review, and obviously the service area has historically experienced extreme cold events, though the magnitude of those extremes, of course, varies by region. Climate change is projected to continue to drive warmer temperatures in the Pacific Northwest, which of course would reduce the overall frequency of extreme cold events across the region in the medium to long term, right? But climate change does not preclude cold snaps occurring, particularly over the next decade or two. And there's some evidence, right, that suggests climate change could invigorate or worsen cold extremes resulting from polar vortex events or other processes in that, and again, in that near to medium term, i.e. through 2050. The figure on the left shows an example of this, right, from NOAA and polar vortex events. That science is always ongoing in the literature, but it's worth noting, right? We do see this, something like the Texas cold snap that happened, 2 or so years ago, right? Was a deep cold snap resulting from one of these polar vortex events. And then finally, the last bullet here, just worth noting some research out of Portland State University, recently peer-reviewed, right, that the Pacific Northwest has a non-Gaussian or particularly long, right, cold temperature distribution, right, which means that cold snaps in the Pacific Northwest are relatively rare compared to places like Minnesota, or even parts of eastern Canada, for example. But that means that long cold tail means that as you shift a temperature distribution to the right due to climate change, right, a warming of the distribution, a shift to the right, you still preserve that cold tail, right, because it's longer than Gaussian, which means that again, right, climate change is going to reduce the frequency of cold events, but does not preclude them from occurring over the near to medium term. All right, I'll stop. That's all I had. I don't know if we have any time, or if there's any questions. Happy to answer.
Yeah, Byron, go ahead.
Yeah, could you go back one slide, please?
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could explain kind of like why it seems like there's a lot more like volatility or variability on the SSP2 versus the SSP3. And I was wondering if you could kind of like explain a bit about like why the models have such disagreement. Like the 3 seems to be a lot more like concentrated and consistent in its results, whereas the 2 seems to be a lot more varied. Could you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the reasons for that would be that SSP 370 is that less likely, more aggressive, right, emission scenario. And so essentially what it's doing is driving a greater forcing on the climate system than SSP 245. And as a result, right, then you get a bit of a tighter coupling, right, in the model outcomes for 470 relative to 45, right, just because the warming signal, the emission signal is greater. That's just one sort of macro thing that's going on. There may be other local factors that are at play.
And I guess I kind of a follow-up question I have is if you go back, I think one more slide. I guess one more to the one where you're talking about like the emissions trajectories. This one, yeah. So it talks about like pledged policies, and I'm wondering if the analysis around the SSPs takes into account like the effects of offshoring. So, for example, like if say the largest emitters in the world, like say the United States, Europe, and China, all have pledged emissions that are in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, but as a result of those agreements, those emissions get offshored. Is that something that's considered in that analysis? That those emissions might just be shifted to other regulatory regimes that aren't as adequate?
Yeah, it's a good and interesting point, and I unfortunately don't know the ins and outs enough of this paper to like fully comment on that. I can say that SSP 370 and certainly something like SSP 585 are aggressive, right? Near worst case emissions trajectories, right? And the SSPs, when they've done the new SSPs here, the 3 and 5 and 2, et cetera, right? They've thought about different socioeconomic scenarios that consider exactly what you're speaking to. I don't know to what degree and how it fits into here per se, but they certainly think about, regional rivalries and like different socioeconomic, diverging socioeconomic trajectories that have like real tangible impacts to offshoring and how the emissions sort of distribution is decided across the globe.
Okay. And does it account for like land use issues? So like there's a lot of like positive feedback loops with like changing albedo and like northern permafrost melt. So for example, this summer it was hotter in northern Canada than it was in Florida. And that has significant like emissions consequences. Whereas the graph here just says global fossil fuel emissions, which is not necessarily the same thing as land use changes.
Certainly the global climate models consider right atmosphere, earth feedbacks and those types of scenarios and their response to emissions, but the SSPs, right, may not treat those as explicitly as you're saying. I mean, however, right, the way I often think about it is something like SSP 370 is even if our economies are not, emitting as many as the level of emissions, right, that you could, get under SSP 370, like the fact that is such a high emission scenario does implicitly capture the potential for, natural feedbacks in the climate, natural or unnatural, depending on how you think about it, but i.e. permafrost or, slowing of uptake in the oceans of CO2 and things like that. And that's sort of a common way to, that at least climate scientists like me, interpret and think about these SSPs.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, Byron, for those questions, and thanks, Mason, for that presentation. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so thanks, Mason. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. I'm going to jump into the demand forecast presentation, and I'll also bring up that if anyone is interested, I'm going through the methodology. I'll give some detail on the methodology, but there's a much more detailed presentation in our targeted tag 5. So if you want to go back and review that after this meeting, if you're interested, that would be great. Okay, so here's the process. It takes in a lot of inputs. I'm actually going to dive into different aspects of this, so I'm going to go past this, but you can see here in how all of these different things come together, how the inputs are put into the use per customer forecast, and then the customer forecast up here, and then the use per customer forecast. And then those are combined. Once you have use per customer and then the number of customers, you come up with the actual usage, or what we call demand. So here we take in our inputs. We gather data using pipeline data, using Woods and Pool. For some economic data, we use weather data from Schneider Electric, and then we pull customer care and billing data. And what we do is we end up using our pipeline data because it is at the daily level, matching that up with our CC&B to get it allocated out into the different rate schedules. And then we are able to align, since the pipeline data is at a daily level, we're able to align that better with HEDs, whereas the customer care and billing data, it is on a billing system. So you could be billed in 1 month, but your usage, like half of your usage could have been from the previous month. So that data comes in a little wonky when you're trying to do analysis and fit regressions. The main driver for usage is HEDs. And so this methodology here is to try to unify those inputs and match up the HEDs to our use as best as possible. So use per customer forecast. So I'll jump into this a little bit. So this is where we are trying to forecast our usage per customer, and we break it out by the different zones, pipeline zones, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, and our different rate schedules. Those are like your residential class, your commercial class, your industrial class, and so on and so forth. And then we try to build relationships with different explanatory variables. So things like HED. When it gets colder outside, your use goes up. So what we do is we try to put in different types of regressors that would explain our usage. So HED is one of them. So that's heating degree day. Those who are not familiar with heating degree day, it's basically you take your temperature, let's say your temperature is 50, and then you take a reference temperature. We use 60 as our reference temperature. So you take 60 minus that temperature of 50, and you get 10 HEDs. Anything, so like if it's a 70 degree Fahrenheit day out, you'll get negative 10 HEDs, but that is put at anything that's negative is automatically set at 0, mainly because the load is then flat. You have a base load at that point.
Hey, Brian, one quick thing. It's your average daily temperature. So that 50 you were using?
Yeah, it would be your daily average temperature. Yes. Yep. Thanks for the clarification. Then we have a weekend indicator. You'll notice in the results of the regressions that most of the time on the weekends, there's fewer usage, especially you'll see this a lot on the commercial and industrial side. If the commercial business or the industrial business is closed on a weekend, you'll see the usage decline. So we have a weekend indicator. We also have a wind indicator. Typically, the higher the wind, the more usage you'll see. So that'll have a positive relationship. So when I say positive, it means that when temperatures go, or when wind speed goes up, use goes up. Retail price. The purpose of including retail price is for a price elasticity. If price goes up, customers may be more willing to turn down their thermostat a little bit, leading to a decrease in usage. So this would have like a negative relationship. So as prices go up, therms would go down. And then we try to capture the trend, Fourier terms, and ARIMA models. So what those do is they capture any trends that it finds. It captures seasonality, specifically the Fourier terms, capture seasonality, the ups and downs of the use per customer. And then the ARIMA models, it captures any moving averages, it captures autoregressive, any autoregressive terms in the model as well. So when we do this for, like I mentioned, every customer class for the different pipeline zones that we have. Are there any questions on that before I jump to the customer forecast? Okay. So customer forecasts are very similar. We use linear regression models, dynamic linear regression models, I should say. Again, it's done at that same level. That way we can tie the use per customer to the customer count forecast. What we do is we take household data projections from Woods and Pool as well as employment data. Usually household data is found to be statistically significant in residential, and then employment is typically statistically significant in commercial and industrial regressions. We also include a retail price. So the theory there is to if find any price elasticity with prices. If prices are going up, maybe customers leave the system or end up electrifying, or end up in some cases a commercial business could move to a different state or something like that. As of right now, the historical data does not indicate any statistical significance with retail price and customer forecast. So that is something that we are going to expand on in the electrification model. I don't have any details on the electrification model today, but that will come at a later tag meeting. Similarly with retail price, we also looked at income levels. Income levels were statistically significant in some regressions. Now the impact was very minimal. And this just indicated that like the higher the income, the more customers were being added to the location. And then again, this has Fourier terms and ARIMA. You'll notice when we get to the results that there is some seasonality with customers. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
How is the retail price lagged?
Yes, that's a good question. We do lag it 1 year. So we take the retail price, we have historical data on the actual data. So we take the actual prices that customers would see on their bill, and then we lag it 1 year. Thanks for that question, Eric. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing again. I wanted to go back to the website again, since we are posting our documents, the results of our, I want to just run through real quick and make sure people understand what is out there. So for now, what we have, if everyone can see my screen, is a couple of results based on the different climate policies and then the different customer forecasts. When looking at these, you'll want to make sure you look at these documents in tandem with the documents out in the actual IRPs. So we have the historical IRPs. You could, like, if you're reviewing the voided cost, I'd recommend opening up the 2023 IRP. Eventually, we will be sharing the draft of the narrative document of this year's. And so I would recommend taking a look at that. There may be some changes to the voided cost, which will be reflected in the when we send out the draft of the narrative. But for the demand forecast, so if you're looking at these, what you'll see is GTN.CNG or 101. So just to let everyone know what those mean. So the GTN before the period, that represents this pipeline zone. And so if you're to come here, you can see there's a list here of the different pipeline zones and the different meters behind it. Most of these meters tied to a city. So like Acme, Washington, Wenatchee, Washington, so on and so forth. If you scroll down into our maps, you can see here, there's a pipeline zone map for Washington and then Oregon. And this shows you the areas. So zone 30, zone 30W is up here. Zone 30S is here. 26 ranges through the I-5 corridor, or the gorge, and then along the I-5 corridor. Then you have zone 20. Zone 20 goes up towards Spokane. And then you have zone 10 up until the Zilla compressor station, and then zone 11 after that. And then zone me is down here. Zone me is broken up into zone me Oregon, which contains Oregon. And then there's zone me Washington, which includes a little couple of places here in southeast Oregon, or southeast Washington, sorry. And then Oregon, you have here's zone me again, so that's where that ties together. And then zone 24. And then you have GTN that comes down and serves as Central Oregon. So that's how that should be read in terms of the before the period. After the period, this is the rate schedule. So you'll see CNG or you'll see CNG WA. That represents the state it's in. So Oregon, or is Oregon, WA is Washington. And then the different numbers are the rate schedules. So we have 101, which is residential, 104, so on and so forth. And those can be found out on the company's webpage. Here's the different rate schedules. So 503, residential service, Oregon, 101 service. So that's the intention there. If there ever a document out there that you're
2021.
Hey, Carolyn, did you have a question? Oh, no. Okay. So if there's ever a document out there and you're curious about it, please let me know if you have any questions. I can point you in the right direction. And kind of explain what some of the data is behind these. Okay. And please feel free to review the data. This data will be the input data for our models. So like this data will go into our Plexos model. And we'll be doing resource integration modeling on it. Okay, let me make sure I'm sharing this presentation again. Okay. Are there any questions? I still have some more slides on the customer forecast. Oops, push the wrong button. Okay. So that is so what I discussed there was the base model that captures the economic data, some of the trends, things like that. There's also things that the model doesn't do a very good job of capturing, and that's big regime changes, impacts to the model that historically has not been seen. And so for now, what I'm talking about is the building code impacts. So the building codes, they've put these targets and goals and mandates in place to reduce the energy from homes, from buildings, residential buildings, commercial buildings, so on and so forth. There's these different RCWs that if people are interested can read up on. But yeah, this RCW moved towards a 70% reduction in annual net energy. This is a mandate and is a pretty clear goal. And then there's this other RCW 1927A, 022A, enacting legislation resulted from 2009 SB 5854. Again, different building code, directions. The most recent, I'll jump into the most recent building code, Washington State building codes. These went into effect on March 15th of 2024. But you can see here on the right, what for a builder to, and this is with my limited knowledge, there's probably more people out there with much more knowledge on building codes than me. It's my understanding that a dwelling needs to have a certain number of credits, and I'm probably oversimplifying this as well. But for example, like a small dwelling must have 5 credits, and then you can see here the description of the primary heating source, and then the number of credits it can receive for that heating source. So as you can see here, for combustion heating equipment meeting federal efficiency standards, it's 0 credits. So you can see how the new building codes have made it a little impractical for residential and commercial new construction with natural gas. Are there any questions on that, on the Washington State Building Code? Okay. Oregon customer count impact. So Oregon has signed with 8 other states to create 9 states pledge joint action to accelerate transition to clean buildings. So what this does, they have a shared goal for heat pumps to at least be 65% of residential scale heating, air conditioning, and water heating shipments by 2030, and then 90% by 2040. So you can see new construction, Oregon has a goal to aim for inclusion of more heat pumps and less gas equipment this is for new construction. But one thing that we want to make sure is to understand is when policies are mandates versus goals and things like that, it's important for Cascade to understand the risks around these customer count forecasts. So if anything were to change in the direction of more gas customers or less gas customers, Cascade wants to make sure to capture that and understand the impacts it has on low carbon alternative fuels and the customers that are going to be on the system in the future. So that brings Cascade to different customer growth scenarios. So as right now under the Washington State building codes and the targets that you see in Oregon, there's a lot of uncertainty around customer growth. But the IRP needs a customer growth forecast as a baseline to start running analysis on, to understand in a high growth scenario, what do our carbon compliance goals look like? What kind of, what are our costs going to look like under the CCA, under the CPP, and so on and so forth. So that's why Cascade has created these different scenarios. You'll see the base is a flat customer growth. Cascade has looked at historical data of customers leaving the system without reconnecting, and it's been about 0.15 to 0.2%. This number, we don't report on what the reasoning was for leaving and not reconnecting, but it's the best estimate we have for customers leaving the system and not coming back. It could be due to electrification, could just be that the house was condemned, something like that. Cascade wants to make sure that it understands the low as well if customers start to decline for whatever reason. So you look at the average life of a home and it varies. Some claim 50 to 70 years. We have houses on our system beyond that. So that number varies quite a bit. in the energy efficiency model, we're looking at a building stock attrition rate of 2%, but that is just the number of homes that are looking, they have to make a decision at that 50-year mark. If they're going to renovate, if they're going to replace, make a decision to electrify, so on and so forth. So Cascade is looking at we don't think that number is 2%. We think it's much lower than that. But to be a little conservative, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a 1.5% decay rate. What this will do is it'll show us spreading fixed costs over fewer customers, and we'll be able to analyze the impacts of that. And then we also have a high growth. So let's say that building codes are redacted, or the CCA initiative passes, and customer counts, people start returning to natural gas. We need to understand what kind of impact that'll have, and the risks around it. And so those are the 3 customer growth scenarios that we're focusing on. Each of these are going to have low carbon alternative fuels modeled around them, and so on and so forth. You can see here in these charts what the forecast looks like.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is Patrick Hanks with BIAW. So I'm curious because you're creating this plan for 2024, but it feels like things could vary wildly depending at what voters pick in the next few months, depending on whether we still have the CCA, or also with the 2117 and then 2066, those initiatives. So do you have to try to create a plan that accommodates both sort of the extremes of that projection, or are you going to try to pick one that you think is more likely to plan for?
Yeah, that's exactly it. When it comes to the short-term plan, we're going to have to pick one. We'll look at all 3 of them, and all 3 of them are going to feed into our ultimate plan, our preferred portfolio. But yeah, eventually we're going to have to pick one to be the reference case, which as of right now, it's the base. And then we are also modeling like low carbon alternative fuels around different climate policy. So one would be including the CCA, and then one would be without including the CCA, and just modeling around the social cost of carbon. And I'll discuss some of that a little bit later on, but yeah, that's the idea of it. There's a lot of uncertainty around initiatives. There's a lot of uncertainty around growth in the future. And so the idea here is to try to capture those extremes and make sure that Cascade understands what those extremes look like and can have a plan in place, depending on which way the customer growth ends up going. Thanks for that question, though. Yeah, Byron.
I have a question about seasonality and the 0 and low growth situation. So it seems like your 4-year term is like the seasonal term, right? Is that right?
Sorry, can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah. So I guess I have a question about the seasonality in the base case and the low case. If let's say that the goal of having 0 emission buildings is met by 2030, and we're not seeing any new buildings on the system, why would there be seasonality? Like, why would there be ups in the customer? It seems like, why wouldn't it be a one-way ratchet?
Yeah, so the seasonality is not the seasonality. I guess we probably I wouldn't consider that growth. I would just consider it customer counts. So what happens is you can see in the historical data. So up to this point, that's where we have historical data. There's seasonality within customers. So these customers, what they do is during the summer, especially if they're furnace only, and maybe if there's someone else on the call that knows precisely why. My understanding is that there's customers who end up going on vacation and just suspending their service. And so what they do is they come off as a customer count, and it ends up reducing our customer count. When they return and they turn their gas back on for the winter, they turn it back on. They call Cascade and say, can I return my service? And then they become a customer count again. And so that's what the seasonality is. We have a lot fewer customers in the summer than we do in the winter. Historically, when you look at like month to month customer counts, you'll have negative growth or negative customer count month over month from like March to about August.
Interesting. I appreciate that insight. It never occurred to me to turn my gas service on and off every year.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as you can see, like there's 35,000 customers, and it's just a handful of customers that it could be for varying reasons. Maybe a lot of people decide to move at the end of the school year, and so they shut off the service. A lot of people sell their homes at the end of the school year. It could be something like that.
Okay. Would Cascade be open to sharing their more recent like customer count data over maybe like the last like 18 months? I'd be curious at just looking at the change in the concavity of that value over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll double check to make sure that's fine, but I'm pretty positive it is.
Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep. So then here, what you'll see is our demand forecast results. And I've compared them to previous IRPs. Previous IRPs obviously didn't have as stringent of building codes and the carbon compliance goals. So you can see how those are increasing more than the current forecasts. But you can see that the base, this one's slightly declining. That's because of the climate impacts. And then obviously the low and the high based on the changing customer count. So the customer count does have a big impact to the demand forecast. Yeah, I'm going to jump into the non-core. So those who are not familiar with the core versus non-core, so we have core customers. That's like your residential, commercial, industrial. And what we do for the core customers, we consider them bundled. And that means we go out and we purchase their upstream transportation, and we purchase their gas for them, and we recover those costs through different mechanisms. And so but the main thing is we plan for their upstream transportation and the purchase of their gas. Non-core, these are generally large industrial customers, electric gen customers. They end up buying and scheduling their own gas. So they make sure that they have their own pipeline capacity. Usually this is generally done through a marketer. And they get the gas to the city gate. And the city gate is where we take the gas off of the upstream pipeline, like Northwest Pipeline or GTN, and we put it onto Cascade's distribution system that we own. And then we use that, our distributions, they pay us for our distribution system to get the gas from the pipeline to their building. Um, transport customers include all types of customers. It ranges from farms to food manufacturers, and it'll vary quite a bit. So some farms you'll end up with um, like breweries and things like that that go out and pick up hops during I think it's towards the end of summer is usually when it's done. And it ends up ramping up really high usage in those months. So these ones are a little less weather dependent and more business dependent in terms of their usage. Cascade also serves 6 electric gen customers in Washington and 1 in Oregon. And those 7 customers project to use almost 600 million therms in 2025. Cascade's transport customers, so it decreased from the previous forecast. And one thing to keep in mind about transport customers is oftentimes you'll end up getting a transport customer that shifts from non-core to core or vice versa, core to non-core, just depending on where they are currently with their business. And so that can have some impact on the customer count numbers as well. And then we have a industrial management group that keeps an eye out for different projects and things, interested parties that want to be on Cascade's distribution system. Cascade projects the non-electric gen transportation customers in Washington and Oregon to consume approximately 525 million therms. And then in terms of Cascade emission responsibility for those customers, we're looking at 105 million therms under the CCA and then 13 million therms under the CPP. I should say the current CPP rules, which is a significant change from the past CPP, which was about 59 million therms. This is mainly due to the removal of EIT customers being under Cascade's responsibility. And those rules are not finalized, so this number could change. A lot of the information about the CPP that you'll hear during this presentation and future presentations, that information may change as the CPP is still being written. And then Cascade sent out a notice to the public back in, I think it was March, discussing some of these bill impacts from the CCA. But Cascade's industrial managers are very much on top of meeting with industrial groups, transport groups, and discussing the CCA impacts and things like that. We'll continue to do so. Okay. Are there any questions about demand forecast, non-core? Any thoughts? Okay. I'm going to suggest we take a 10-minute break. Let's do 9 minutes, and we'll meet back at 10:25 to finish off the presentation. All right, everyone, it's 10:25, so we'll get going again. Bailey, are you back?
Yes.
All right, I'll kick it over to you.
All right, I'm going to go over the regional market outlook, and then after I'm going to be covering our avoided cost methodology. So Brian, if you can go to the next slide. So for our long-term regional market outlook, we utilize insights from EIA's annual energy outlook for 2023, which was released March 2023. There hasn't been a more recent long-term outlook released since then, so this is the most current data. Looking at natural gas's role in electricity generation in the long term, we see domestically a decrease by 2050 relative to 2022, which actually contrasts with the relatively stable growth we've seen over the past decade. This bottom graph here gives a visual of what that forward-looking projection is going to look like. According to the EIA, natural gas production increases by 15% from 2022 to 2050, and that's outpacing domestic consumption. And this increase in domestic natural gas production is actually encouraged by international demand. Brian, you can go to the next slide, please. All right. So looking at the most recent summer months, electric power generation was the primary driver for natural gas consumption. The recent heat wave in July saw a 13% increase in natural gas consumption in the electric power sector compared to June. And then although comfortable storage levels and steady production would encourage a bearish outlook for natural gas prices in the short term, the potential for extreme weather events and increased cooling demand could introduce upward pricing as the month progresses. Any questions on that? Byron?
Yeah. Has Cascade looked at any of the clean energy implementation plans from any of the electric utilities about how much like natural gas they intend to burn for electric generation?
Yeah. So Brian, I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, we've reviewed the clean energy transportation at a pretty high level. Now, one thing to note is that the IRP is mainly focused on the core and transport customers that were responsible for their emissions, mainly because the IRP is focusing a lot on upstream transportation and making sure we have enough for our customers, and optimizing upstream transportation, which we don't have to plan for upstream transportation for the electric gen. And then also the emission responsible. And so we're not responsible for the emissions of the electric gen customers. And so the electric gen has a little more of a back end outside of the IRP look when we do look at it. So we probably won't discuss the impacts of the CETA and those things at a high level throughout the IRP. But yeah, we definitely keep an eye on those and track those changes.
So you're not anticipating any I mean, it seems like if they have increasing demand or if their demand were to decline significantly, it would have impacts on the capacity needs of the system. Is that accurate or am I misunderstanding?
The capacity, so the electric gen, and we may need someone else to jump in, but my understanding is we don't plan for the electric gen on the distribution system because they're considered interruptible. Someone can come in and correct me if that's wrong.
So this is Mike Parvinen with regulatory. That's a true statement in Oregon. Not in Washington, because we do have firm transportation schedules.
Okay. Yeah, the CETA will be definitely something we'll want to look at on the distribution side if there's significant decline in electric gen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Byron.
All right. Yeah, we can move on to avoided costs. So I'm going to be going over our avoided cost methodology and how we put together our calculation. With the avoided cost, there are many different ways to approach it. So we appreciate any feedback or questions or thoughts on our avoided cost calculation. Okay. So to start, looking at an overview of our avoided cost forecast, we do a 27-year price forecast now instead of just a 20-year price forecast to allow us to get to 45 years of avoided costs. Specifically, we want to focus on those costs up to 2050 because that's going to allow us to get as accurate as one can going out for a 27-year price forecast. So what is avoided cost? It's really the estimated cost to serve the next unit of demand with a supply side resource at an option in time. So it's the counterweight to the cost associated with our energy efficiency programs. So for example, let's say it's going to cost 50 cents per therm to install a more efficient water heater. The avoided cost would need to be higher than that for that to be considered a cost-effective resource with some caveats. And you can look at a more holistic portfolio analysis, and there's also certain measures that are exempt from the cost-effective analysis, but the scope of the avoided cost is limited to addressing just these measures. And there's other questions on other processes that are great, but they just move beyond the scope of the avoided cost. So this incremental cost to serve represents the cost that could be avoided through energy conservation. So it can be used as a guideline. It's used to compare energy conservation with the cost of acquiring and transporting natural gas. So avoided cost covers from beginning to end, starting from the minute the gas is purchased to the minutes used at our customers' homes or businesses. Every step of the way, we want to capture all those costs to create a holistic picture of what the cost to serve is, so that it can be compared to the cost of energy efficiency. Brian, you can go to the next slide. So as an overview, we're continuing to evolve our avoided cost calculations. A lot of the things in this tag are going to be similar for those who participated in our past IRPs. The various elements of the avoided costs will need to be reconsidered with regards to emissions reduction goals. We produced our avoided costs on peak day, and in the case of distribution system costs, it's peak hour. And that's an important consideration because distribution planning is done at the hourly level. So when we're coming up with the factor or a cost for a distribution cost, not only do we want to account for how it performs on peak day, but particularly on peak hour. Here is the formula for our avoided cost calculation. There's several different factors you can see here that go into it. I'm going to break these down a little bit more in the next slide just to make it more consumable, but the nominal avoided cost can be converted into real dollars. And we do that by taking it divided by 1 plus the discount rate to the number of years from a reference year. Brian, we can go to the next one, please. Thank you. All right, so here's an overview of our methodology. Variable transport costs are pulled directly from the major pipelines that Cascade utilizes, and our fixed transportation costs are only included when avoidable. So for example, when there's a potential to offset upstream capacity acquisitions. So for transportation costs, there's both the cost to reserve the capacity to flow our gas on a pipeline. That's our fixed cost. And then there's a cost for every therm that we do flow, which is our variable cost. We can't avoid the fixed cost to reserve the capacity because we've already reserved it and it's in place, and it's going to be in place until that contract expires. But we can avoid not flowing on that contract, and that variable cost or that transportation cost is avoidable. And different upstream pipelines are going to charge different rates for their variable costs. So since we're concerned with the marginal cost of the next therm that flows, we're going to take an average of these pipelines' variable rates since we don't know which pipeline that therm will flow on. The one time the fixed costs are potentially avoidable is if we needed to acquire new capacity. So for example, let's say in Bremerton, we needed to be able to get more transportation to that specific speedy gate. From an upstream perspective, what we'd want to do is go out to Northwest Pipeline, explain that we're going to need more capacity over there, and they would give us a quote to build an expansion. And then we could convert that cost to what that cost would be on a per therm basis. And that theoretically would be an avoided cost. All right. Storage costs are only captured if there's an avoidable future storage cost. So now for storage costs, only the variable costs are really avoidable. So once again, it's only included if it's avoidable. Storage is an interesting one for Cascade because we don't have any on-system storage. So for those of you who are more familiar with Northwest Natural, they have their MIST facility, which is where they're able to take gas from and put it right into the Portland distribution system. We don't have that. So storage for us is mostly just a price arbitrage and a peak day resource. So from an avoided cost perspective, storage costs typically don't come into play. The exception would be if we were to need to build an on-system storage facility for whatever reason, maybe to serve peak day demand. If all of a sudden we had like an opportunity to build a storage facility, then there could be some avoided cost with that because it would hook right into our distribution system, but we don't have that. So you can expect this value to be 0. For Cascade system right now, all storage is off system and provides a net positive benefit to customers. So it doesn't qualify as an avoided cost. Commodity costs come from our 27-year price forecast. And during the 2023 Irp Tag process, there were questions about whether this represented Cascade's marginal commodity costs, and some stakeholders about the idea of RNG being a more accurate representation of Cascade's marginal commodity cost. However, when evaluating the cost of RNG, it's important to separate the physical gas molecules from the environmental attributes. And this is because the avoided cost from the environmental attributes is already captured in the environmental compliance element of the avoided cost. So including it in here would be double counting this cost. The physical gas molecules are typically valued at the basis price of one of the basins Cascade purchases from, which aligns with Cascade's current methodology of using the price forecast to capture avoided commodity costs. Moving on to environmental compliance costs, we have the social cost of carbon with a 2.5% discount rate adjusted to real 2021 dollars, as well as the Climate Commitment Act cost added to our carbon tax. And I'm going to touch a little bit more on our environmental compliance costs in a little bit. The company's distribution system cost calculation looks at forecasted expenses related only to growth and uses the company's load growth forecast to translate these costs to a per therm basis. And distribution system projects can be broken down into 2 classifications, system integrity enhancements and then growth related projects. So system integrity projects would only be avoidable if the demand associated with the project were eliminated entirely. Reducing demand, which is the objective of these processes of the avoided cost calculations and conservation efforts, doesn't prevent embrittled pipes from needing to be replaced, for example. So these projects are not avoidable. But growth-related projects, on the other hand, are projects that are needed to support forecast demand growth on a given distribution system. Since the need is purely related to growth, these are potentially avoidable or at least deferrable, and therefore part of the avoided cost calculation. For risk premium is calculated as the delta from deterministic and stochastic pricing. So we're defining risk premium for this RFP as the difference between the impacts of an extreme upward price movement versus that of an extreme downward price movement. So to explain this a little bit more, due to the log normal nature of stochastic prices, the risk presented from rising prices is higher than that of falling prices. And by risk of falling prices, I mean, if you were to hedge and prices fall, you do have a potential loss for that. While if you're unhedged and energy efficiency can be looked at as a hedge for this perspective, if you're exposed to prices, the higher prices are more of a risk. So this analysis is used as a risk adjustment price calculation. So that's kind of our philosophy on when we're trying to do risk-based quantitative analysis, similar to what Northwest Natural does. What we do is 75% of the deterministic results are weighted as such, and 25% of the stochastic results. It's just qualitative adjustments, and we've been doing it for a little while now. We like that it weighs more heavily towards what you would expect to happen, but it still gives credence to that unexpected element. So we do that similar process in that risk-adjusted price analysis calculation, and that's done to calculate the final risk premium. And lastly, the environmental adder. It still applies to all elements of the avoided cost as per WTC staff guidance, and it's still 10% as per NWPCC guidance. We can move to the next slide if there aren't any questions. Byron?
Yeah, so I guess first I want to add a caveat here that UTC staff doesn't speak on behalf of the commission. So, we don't speak in a representative capacity. But has Cascade considered I think I've mentioned this before, the idea of a elevated avoided cost methodology? Because we've articulated the possible risk of like customer flight due to the combined risks of CCA compliance costs going up, as well as the ratio of fixed cost to customers going up. And I guess I'm imagining that if we were to have an elevated avoided cost, it could be a way of keeping customers on the system in order to keep the ratio of fixed costs from getting too high, if that makes sense. That is, if we were to have the avoid cost be higher, we can imagine in one scenario, customers flee at, or leave the system at X rate. And in a second scenario with an elevated avoided cost, we could target those customers who are most likely to electrify, keep their bills down with a higher avoided cost, keep the CCA compliance costs down, and that way retain more customers on the system and keep that fixed cost ratio from getting from spiraling out of control. Have you guys considered that, or are you guys, or is that not something you guys are considering for this IRP process?
Yeah, so the concept of a greater avoided cost leading to lower CCA costs and retaining more customers, it leads to a type of infinite iterate loop. So lower CCA costs and retaining customers will lead to customer growth, which leads to higher CCA costs. And then the addition of distribution system costs, and those costs will lead customers to eventually leave the system, which will then lead to lower CCA costs, and then the removal of distribution system costs, and so on and so forth. So it kind of is a perpetuated system. And then also the voided cost from Cascade's understanding is more of a utility cost test. So Cascade obviously understands the responsibility to customers and to consider their interests, but we view it as more a utility-centric measure So if we were to transition to the avoided cost calculation being more of a customer-centric benefit, I feel like that would be something that a conversation that would need to be had between all the utilities moving forward. If that answers your question.
I think it does answer the question. I guess I would just highlight that in terms of like potential tools in our tool set in order to avoid these kind of systemic instabilities, I think it's very much in the company's own interest to consider that as a potential tool.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Byron.
This is Devin. I actually want to weigh in on that a little bit also. I think one thing that's important to note is with the, for lack of a better term, punitive analysis being performed on the conservation potential assessment process, I think we need to be very careful about what levers we attempt to trigger when it comes to this specific insulated process. I think exogenous potentially to the avoided cost and CPA process, there is, in my world, in the renewables world, I think reviewing and viewing and analyzing energy efficiency or demand side management above and beyond this insulated process is an important consideration to potentially look at emissions reductions towards meeting things like CCA compliance. But this specific insulated process is very much about a cost effectiveness test. As Bailey said, we look at that cost effectiveness test when performing this. If we were to go above and beyond that, by the very definition of it being a cost-effective test, the things that we would do would end up being ultimately not cost-effective measures. And that's not cost-effective when evaluating things such as those CCA costs, social costs of carbon, based on that policy statement, not, once again, not staff policy statement, but just that policy statement that was issued, and all of those other factors. So I think we're very hesitant, knowing that the stakes have been raised, for lack of a better sense, on the conservation potential side of things. I think we're very hesitant towards moving those levers in the favor of non-cost effective measures, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. Like, it is very much a balancing act between, you have the different notions of what cost effective is, in the sense that you're right that we have this notion of it being the cost of the fuels, CCA, and the social cost of greenhouse gases. But then there's also these kind of hidden costs in terms of like the ratio of customer accounts to fixed costs, where it's not a system cost, but it's a cost that the customers have to pay. And so like as that ratio shifts, like if customers do electrify in rates that we don't anticipate or in an exponentially increasing rate, it presents a very clear instability for the company. And so I'm not saying that I have a definitive answer here. I think it's just something to consider in terms of potential strategies in order to mitigate these sort of instabilities that might fundamentally harm the company. So I'm not saying definitively one way or the other. I think it's an interesting perspective that I think merits consideration.
Yeah, I think there is validity to that. And I think kind of to the point that Bailey said, I think she put it best, that's an industry-wide potential evaluation, right? And I think that's something that we would want to have multiple entities collaborate on before we wouldn't want to step out and be the first person to initiate something like that. I think that's something, since it would affect our entire industry, that we would want to see some kind of industry forum and discussion where something like that would be evaluated.
All right, thanks, Byron, for your question. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to move on to this next slide. So here we have what was previously presented in our targeted tag 2 for our environmental compliance costs. For this avoided cost calculation, we added both the social cost of carbon and the Climate Commitment Act costs into the calculation. And this was per U 230161 CA policy statement guidelines. But it should be noted that these guidelines have since been withdrawn. We're going to continue to evaluate the social cost of carbon being included in the avoided cost calculation. Are there any questions on that?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Okay, go ahead. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering on how you adjust your calculation for the social cost of carbon, because my understanding is that's trying to actualize the cost that carbon emissions have on society, but the Climate Commitment Act actualizes at least a certain portion of those costs. So do you adjust the number that you're using for the social costs because of the CCA?
Brian, do you want to chime into that?
Yeah, so I can jump in. So yeah, Cascade's stance on the social cost of carbon is that before this policy came out, we had made the stance that the CCA was actualizing what the social cost of carbon calculation was doing. And then the policy statement came out. Cascade had adjusted the avoided cost to include the social cost of carbon, and then we had provided the avoided cost to the energy efficiency group, and then the policy statement was withdrawn after that. It seems pretty clear based on that policy statement, and I know it's been withdrawn, that it was pretty clear that the social cost of carbon should be accounted for in addition. Now, we've debated whether we want to go back to our stance of using just the Climate Commitment Act environmental adder, the compliance adder. The question is, do we get down the road in the IRP and then the policy statement comes back that I believe requires the use of social cost of carbon in addition to the CCA? And so there's a little bit of uncertainty there on what may happen and what's going to be required from us. As of right now, we've left the social cost of carbon in there. But yes, it has been Cascade's stance in the past that the Climate Commitment Act is actualizing the social cost of carbon. And so we believe that the CCA compliance costs would capture that compliance adder. Hopefully that answers your question. Oh, go ahead.
Does the sort of the policy or the statute, does it have a specific methodology that you have to use, or can you is there some leeway in what methodology you use to determine the social cost of carbon?
Yeah, there's a technical document. I don't know if we reference it here, but we can definitely provide you that information on the social cost of carbon calculation that we use.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Byron?
Yeah, I thought I might chime into the conversation just to provide a little bit of clarity too. So the social cost of carbon rate is also found on the UTC website. It's based on a Obama administration era findings. And then it's been extrapolated out using adjusted annually for inflation. Yep. But to also get to the question of whether, and again, this is staff's opinion, this is not speaking for the commission, but speaking about the question of social cost of carbon versus CCA. From a statutory standpoint, when the CCA was implemented, it didn't have a clear carve out saying that the social costs shouldn't be also added. So it didn't say now that we have the CCA, we no longer do the social cost of greenhouse gases. There's no statutory basis for choosing between one or the other. And then from a kind of an ontological standpoint, the CCA and the social cost of greenhouse gases are measuring theoretically fundamentally different things. The social cost is very much this idea of what harms result from emissions, whereas the CCA is, at least in theory, tied to the production costs. So what are the production costs in order to lower emissions versus this increasing market pressure from these auctions? And so it's kind of burning a candle with two wicks from opposite ends, so to speak, is that one is looking at production, whereas another's looking at the consequences of emissions. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarity on why they would be additive, both from a statutory standpoint and from a theoretical standpoint.
Thanks, Byron.
All right, we can move on to the next slide. So lastly, we have our results from our avoided cost calculation. I've included down below those costs in 2025, 2040, and 2050, which are $1.38 per therm, $2.07 per therm, and $2.54 per therm, respectively. We've noted that there is an 84% increase from 2025 to 2050. And since the avoided cost calculation from our 2023 RP, there's been about a 30 to 40% increase in those costs. And the bulk of this increase can be attributed to the increase in commodity costs, as well as the addition of the social cost of carbon to the carbon tax. Are there any more questions before we wrap up avoided cost? Yes, Byron?
Yeah, I'd sent Brian a question ahead of time asking for clarification around why the different zones have the same avoided cost. Looking at the geographies of like where the gas comes from and how you kind of a non-contiguous service territory. I was wondering if you could explain, like, I understand that the customers are paying the same tariff or the same rates, but if you could target conservation in one area that's predominantly using gas that's sourced from one area, wouldn't that change a different avoided cost, like geographically?
So as noted in our PGA, the way we distributing prices in particular, prices are blended, so each customer is going to be paying the same cost regardless of zone. I don't know if Brian or Devin want to add to that.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, Byron, you bring up a good point. Yeah, so we've been kind of thinking about that, the targeting one area of the zone. I think you do bring up a good point about how if you target an area with the actual program, how that could impact the avoided costs. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. But yeah, the perspective that we're taking is that especially with these costs on transportation costs and like for example, the social cost of carbon, the carbon compliance adder, and the commodity cost is about 91% of the avoided cost. But yeah, when it comes to the different zones of the transportation, things like that, those have very minimal impacts. And yeah, it's definitely spread out through the different customers. But you bring up a good point about the program itself may have an impact, and I think the programs are captured on the energy efficiency side. I'll have to go back and discuss internally what you brought up here though, because you do bring up a good point.
I mean, the other thing is I think Caleb might be able to give some insight here, but I also imagine that having a consistent avoided cost would probably also make things programmatically easier on his end. So it just as a matter of efficiency, there's probably efficiency gains to having a uniform cost as opposed to having everything being different. Yes. But yeah, so I'm not necessarily objecting to this. I'm just wondering if it's true in reality versus pragmatic, like systemic needs.
Yes. No, that's a good point. And we'll definitely discuss that internally and kick that around.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for avoided costs. If there aren't any more questions, I'll pass it back off to Brian for the next one, or Eric is presenting.
Yep, go to Eric.
Yeah, me. Good morning, good me. That's me, rather, Eric Wood, manager of gas supply. We'll talk a little bit, just briefly, about kind of basics of gas supply in terms of what I do to get gas to the system. These are basically three components of our gas supply. So we have transport, commodity, and storage. Our transportation portfolio is built from the past, from those contracts that we've acquired. And so we have contracts on 6 different pipelines, and we have deliverability basically off the 3 pipelines. So when we build our supply portfolio, we build around that transportation portfolio in order to utilize that transportation to get the physical commodity to our system. The commodity component is the physical gas purchased on the open market. There's market hubs within each region, and we purchase that gas monthly, sometimes daily, depending upon our need. And so it's done via an RFP process that we use. It's a platform that we've been using for quite a while, or we can do direct contact with the supplier to purchase that supply. Cascade works with about 12 to 15 active suppliers. We have more RFPs that go out than are active, and so some of those marketers kind of come and go. So it just varies season to season, and sometimes some marketers fade off and others kind of join in. And so it's definitely market driven in terms of who's the players available in the region. And then we have our storage. And so I'll get in a little bit more on storage, but we have 3 different storage facilities that we use. And we use storage as a hedge, not only for price arbitrage between summer and winter, but also against day-to-day market prices too. I think it was 2 years ago where we had a pretty cold winter. We avoided day market prices, which are in the $40 to $50 range daily for a pretty long extended period of time. And so we were able to manage through that with storage without having to be in that day market. And so that's just kind of one advantage definitely of having storage. Day-to-day operations for balancing entitlement as well. We depend on it heavily more and more as the pipeline gets more and more constrained all the time. And there's more entitlements that take place than ever before. And so storage is really a day-to-day tool that we really have to have in order to operate the system. Next. So, the basic system map that we've seen before, our service territory is definitely broken up into a lot of different locations. And, that is part of the reason why we have so much transport across varying pipelines in order to get gas to the system. And so each area depends sometimes on different pipelines in order to get that to the system. So just a basic overview. Go ahead, next, Brian. This gets a little bit more into pipeline flow and how that works. These are kind of the numbers that we have on those pipelines and the directions of flow that we would typically flow onto our system. In the Rockies region, we have that, we place gas little PAL there, and we can flow that across Ruby. And so Ruby we have during the winter to use. And that just helps us meet the Central Oregon demand as well. Most of our gas does come from SUMA southbound, and so that's kind of the vast majority of gas that we get onto our system. But then we also push up gas from the Rockies regions north into our system as well. And then part of it in the ACO region in Alberta, and that flows down across NGTL and Foothills, and then on to GTN system. And then we can transfer that onto Northwest Pipe, or we can flow it all the way into Central Oregon. So a lot of different kind of pieces and components of how that works. And then next. And so transportation wise, we hold transport on 6 different pipelines, like I mentioned: Enbridge, Williams, GTN, Nova, Foothills, and Ruby. Nova and Foothills are the upstream pipelines in Canada. And so we don't have in delivery off those systems. Ruby we use in the winter. to get from Northwest Pipe across northern Utah into Oregon for the GTN system in Central Oregon. And so we use that in the winter. And then we have in delivery off of Enbridge, Williams, and GTN. So 3 different pipelines that we deliver gas in delivery to those, like I mentioned. And so, like I mentioned in the past, our portfolio is arranged around what we have available in transport, and the system demands accordingly. Go ahead, Brian. And this is just a really simplistic view. It's not meant to be contiguous. It's just more of a simplistic view of maybe how and where our gas comes from and how that works. And so each of the brown circles there are basically the regions where we get gas. So Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. And then we have the markets within those, Station 2 and Hunt. And then at ACO, we buy at ACO NIT. And then in the Rockies region, we buy at Wyoming Pool, Rocky Mountain Pool, and Opal. And like I mentioned before, Opal is placed there because we need to have that gas placed at Opal in order to flow across Ruby. And so we can flow across Ruby into GTN system and then into our system. The green circles there just represent storage in terms of how that works. Jackson Prairie is directly connected to Northwest Pipe. Mist is connected through Northwest Natural system onto Northwest Pipe. And then Plymouth is also connected directly to Northwest Pipe system. And so we pull gas out of those storage facilities and deliver to our system as well. And then it just shows you some interconnects there. So Star Road, Palouse, and Stanfield are interconnects between GTN and Northwest Pipe. And so we can move gas back and forth between pipelines accordingly when we need to shift gas in parts of our system. So kind of a simplistic model just to show you how gas gets to our system. Hopefully it helps a little bit, but I realize there's a lot of moving parts and components to that. Next, Brian. So our portfolio procurement is designed around a declining ladder. So every year we purchase more in the first year and less in the second year, less in the third year. And so currently what we're doing is we're purchasing approximately 90% of our annual requirements in year 1, 60% in year 2, and then 30% in year 3. That 90% figure gives us flexibility in terms of being able to be in the day market if we had to, but not so much that we're relying heavily in the day market in winter, because in the day market in the winter, I mean, we have seen some really historically high prices. And so we allow some storage utilization, and the storage makes up about 15%. The capacity makes up about 15% of our annual winter load. And so we leave room in our portfolio in order to utilize that storage, but we also leave room for some cushion as well. And then if we kind of blow through that, if it's a really cold winter, you know, we still do have the capability to go out to the day market and purchase gas. Our hedge percentages this year, and so we review this every year with the Gas Supply Oversight Committee, and we make a determination on what we're going to do for hedged percentages. And so this year is 55, 35, and 20 respectively. And our hedging is flexible, so we always look at it month to month. We have guidance that comes out every month, not only in part from our third-party vendor, but our internal team. And they look at that and run the models. And then that helps me to determine where I need to purchase gas and how much in those regions. And it's based upon our portfolio currently. So how much we have left in a specific region that we need to fill, or a specific location. Our annual load expectations around that 37 million decatherms, and that's based upon the IRP team's forecast. And so when I get that forecast, I just look at it and make sure it kind of falls in line with what I would typically expect. I'd look back to the previous years and just look at the months individually to say, that makes sense, plus or minus a margin of error, because every day, there's always a margin of plus or minus in terms of what we deliver to the pipeline, in terms of what gets taken off the pipeline. And then our purchases are multi-length contracts. And so we typically would buy a summer strip or a winter strip. Sometimes I'll do an annual strip. And then other times we have to fill in basically the gaps. So December, January, February are gaps in terms of those winter strips where I actually need above and beyond the other winter strips that I've already purchased. So we have to fill in the holes basically with those. Go ahead, next. This was a look at, I think this was a look at currently what our hedge amount is. Yeah, that's correct. I updated it. And so this is just a look at our table, and it tells me what our forecast usage was, what our needed supply was, what our hedge target was, how much is currently hedged, and how much we have left. And so once again, the rolling portfolio in terms of a step down ladder. And so we just look at that every month. And next. And just a quick note about renewable natural gas, and I'm just talking about the physical molecules here that flow onto our system. I kind of deal with that on the back end after Devin and the team have worked on their projects, and then these are just basically ultimate deliveries to the system. I just take those into account. Currently, there's 2 projects that are flowing onto our system, and it's about 900 decatherms a day typically. And so we just take that into account in terms of upstream resources and do we need to reduce. It's not significant, but it is a little bit in terms of our balancing day to day of what we need to bring onto the system. And next, Brian. This is just a sample. This was from 2022, and it just gives you an idea of what flowed on Northwest Pipe, GTN, and West Coast. And so I just wanted to show you like how much more Northwest does flow, because that's where typically all of our customers are. And then we have a smaller base on GTN and then a smaller base on the in-bridge direct connect. So just gives you a sample of what that would look like over the winter. Go next. And then these are our storage resources that I talked about a little bit already. And so we have 4 accounts in Jackson Prairie for about 1.2 BCF and a capacity of 56,000, or a demand rather of 56,000. So we do target to cycle all of Jackson Prairie during the winter. Winter 23-24 was a little bit warmer, so we didn't cycle as much. Plymouth has 2 accounts for 662 and about 78,000 of demand. And so we would typically use this on peak days. It's a great resource because we can pull large amounts of gas out at a time. And it typically would be used for peaking because it's a slow process to re-inject, and it's also an expensive process to re-inject into Plymouth. So once we pull it out, we typically would not inject it back in during the winter for any reason. We would typically just wait till the summer to do that. Mist is a great resource for us in that we have 1.6 BCF of capacity there and 50,000 of demand. And so I can use this as a peaking resource somewhat because I do have that 50,000 of demand. And then we can also use that as somewhat of a base load too, just given the fact of the total capacity that we have in there. We do want to cycle it once again, but it's just contingent upon pricing and market conditions, what's happened over the winter. And then total storage at 100% of demand, Cascade can meet approximately 67% on a peak day, just meaning that the demand that we have available to pull out at full capacity would meet approximately 67% of our need on a peak day based at 265,000. Just kind of an arbitrary figure, but it just kind of gives you an example. I think 275 is the peak day that I typically use. We've been a little bit over that and we've been under that, but 275 would be kind of considered definitely a peak day for us. This total storage capacity accounts once again for about 14.75% of the overall winter demand. And then, like I mentioned, the other 68% of that peak day. The next. This was our missed storage utilization from last year. I just tracked these annually. Those other lines in there are from the 21-22 and 22-23 season. And then the yellow line is 23-24 season. So I just track those annually just to make sure we're on target. The area in the blue is really kind of the target that we'd like to be at based upon our demand curve. And so I just track these just so we can see where we're at. So I do have for each facility. You can go to the next one, Brian. This was for JP, and you can kind of see at the end of the winter there, we didn't have a lot of usage in the yellow there, and so we did have to re-inject some. And then we ended up in a pretty long position in Jackson Prairie just because of the demand over the winter was pretty minimal for this last winter. And then the next one just shows Plymouth, and Plymouth's a pretty chunky resource. When we do pull it out, we pull out big chunks at a time in order to meet demand. And so it does look a little funny. There's no real utilization curve for it. We just reserve it as a peaking resource. And this would be just an example of a peak day stack. And this can change given the time of year, and it can change given year to year, depending upon what we have. So it shows kind of the current availability that we would have, and then our RFPs that we stack on there, given our ladder that we have in our portfolio. I did put some front of the month spot gas in here. We can buy more or less depending upon the month, depending upon our pipeline position. And then I threw in our JP Mist and Plymouth as at the very top of what we would use there in terms of a resource. And then daily spot gas too, depending upon the market, how much we would get on the day. If market pricing seemed advantage, we could do that too, but we could definitely buy more spot gas on the day, and we can buy more spot gas on the front of the month. So every scenario is a bit different, and every day is different depending upon conditions, time of the month, pricing in the market. And so this would just be one example of many types of examples. And I think that was the last one for me, Brian. So basic overlook, is there anything that I can answer?
Okay. I'm not seeing any questions, so thank you, Eric.
All right, thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we'll jump into the plan scenarios and sensitivities. We have about, I think 7 more slides, 6, 7 more slides left. So we'll push through and get these done with. So yeah, I wanted to touch base on the plan scenarios and sensitivities again. We got some feedback after the targeted tag meeting. And then I want to bring up another thought on the resource integration. So I've talked in pretty good detail about the customer growth forecast. I had mentioned earlier about the climate regulation. There's obviously the initiative out there to discussing the Climate Commitment Act. If that passes, there's still questions about what would happen. But we've also are going to put in a model, the social cost of carbon. So we'll include the social cost of carbon as so like the low carbon alternative fuels would compete against commodity costs with the social cost of carbon attached to it. So that'll be a different scenario. We're still looking at electrification. More to come on that. We're looking at expected costs versus low costs. We'll discuss those at a future meeting. And then one thing that I wanted to bring up was the climate HCDs. So looking at the results of the HEDs, and you can go out to the demand forecast spreadsheet that we've put out there. There's not much of a difference. There's most of the differences in the later years between the 2-4.5 and the 3-7.0. In order to run more low carbon alternative fuel Monte Carlos, one of my recommendations is to reduce this down to one of these. And my recommendation is for the high customer forecast and the base is to use the SSP 3-7.0, which has the larger climate change impacts or the higher decrease in HEDs. And then for the low, using the SSP 2-4.5. And then this would allow us to run more low carbon alternative fuel Monte Carlo simulations. So that would be my recommendation. I will leave that out for everybody to consider. You don't have to give me feedback today on it. If you want to think about it, discuss it internally, please let me know your thoughts on that. So yeah, like I mentioned, the reference case, the Washington State Building Codes with flat growth, including the Climate Commitment Act and what we know of the Climate Protection Plan, expected costs of electrification using the SSP 3-7, and then the low carbon alternative fuels reference case. And then we're going to do a lot of stochastic scenarios. So a lot of the information that's going into our portfolios will come from the stochastic scenarios. So we want to understand under a low growth scenario, the different climate policies, different combinations of electrification costs. And then if we move to just one climate model, that number will just change to 1. And then the different low carbon alternative fuels. So in a low growth under the CCA with expected costs, what does a high RNG cost, low supply scenario look like? What does a lot of RNG supply, low cost RNG look like? And so on and so forth with all the different low carbon alternative fuel Monte Carlo draws that we can run. With that, we would utilize, so if we stuck with the 2 different climates, it would be 12. If we went to 1, we would have 6 different scenarios. Each scenario would then have more Monte Carlo simulations into it. So we wouldn't be reducing the number of results. We would just be reducing the number of scenarios. So the different scenarios, their reference cases, and then the stochastic results from each scenario will be used to build out the short and long-term plans. For the long-term plan, Cascade will utilize these results, taking future potential portfolios, providing results on low carbon alternative fuels. What is a high cost low carbon alternative fuels look like? What does a low cost look like? What are the different ranges of hydrogen and so on and so forth? The different incremental or off takes of transportation, what storage may look like under each of these, what the total system cost would look like under each of these. Would we have any demand shortages under all these different scenarios? What do the carbon compliance targets and costs look like? And then making sure that we have an understanding of the overall risk to ratepayers. Once we have all these built out, the 2 to 4 year action plan will utilize those results of the long-term plan and implement the portfolio that best meets the system demand with the least cost, least risk mix of natural gas, low carbon alternative fuels, and energy efficiency. So if you went back to, I think it was targeted tag 8 and looked at this slide, it would look a lot different. So we've kind of taken a different approach, make sure that we have a preferred portfolio where we want to make sure we have an understanding of the risks. If our preferred portfolio has significant amount of RNG, we want to understand the risks around that. What do the stochastic analysis around RNG look like? If it includes hydrogen in the future years, we'll want to understand the risks of that up to that point. If hydrogen costs end up being higher than expected, what is the next approach? What does that risk look like for our ratepayers? So please feel free to give feedback on that. I think we're at the end. If you have feedback on that, if you have feedback on, or if you have any questions, please let me know. If you have any feedback on anything that we presented beforehand, please let me know. I'm going to pause for like 30 seconds just to make sure everyone gathers their thoughts and can ask those questions. Okay. Not seeing any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. So I'll go ahead and wrap this meeting up. So next steps, we'll have tag 2 on Thursday, October 24th. So coming up in a month and a half, about 6 weeks. We'll respond to any tag 1 feedback. Please, if you have any feedback, please give me a call, shoot me an email. You can also reach us at irp@cngc.com. I'll put that in the chat. You can reach us at that email address. Please let us know if you have any feedback after this meeting. We do need to lock things in. So if you have a recommendation for a big change to the demand forecast, now is the time. We need to lock it in. That way we can run the rest of our analysis around the demand forecast. So similar to the voided cost, we need to lock those in. We do have a voided cost sent out, and we're running some energy efficiency analysis on it, but we still have until May to finalize the IRP. So if there's anything you'd like to see different, please let us know. But at tag 2, we'll discuss alternative resources, price forecast, carbon impacts, energy efficiency. We'll expand on renewable natural gas, and then possibly some preliminary resources. There's still a lot of modeling that needs to be done. But we'll definitely make sure to discuss resource integration results at some point. So here's the remaining schedule. I already talked about tag 2, again, October 24th. If you can, please send us feedback on tag 1 by no later than September 27th. That'll help us make sure that we incorporate everything into the next steps of the process. And then after that, after tag 2, we'll ask for feedback on tag 2, and then we'll provide a first draft of the IRP on December 6th. We'll request for feedback by January 10th, and then we'll hold a tag 3 on February 5th in sending out a final draft. Just a forewarning, the first draft will definitely not be complete. There's going to be a lot of modeling done during that process, but you'll see a lot of first draft of things that have been locked in, like the demand forecast and avoided costs and things like that. So the first draft, it'll be a little incomplete in terms of some of the chapters, but we wanted to get a lot of the chapters done early on. That way people can give feedback early on in the process, and then so on and so forth. and then we'll have a final draft. That one will be more complete. And then we'll ask for comments by April 15th. And then we'll make any final changes that need to be done and have it filed by May 23rd. All right, I'm going to stop and ask for any other questions, any other thoughts. If there's nothing, then we can let everybody go. Okay. I see an applaud from Devin. Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any questions. Again, our email is open. The phone line's open. Please let us know if you have any questions. But if not, we'll see everybody at Tag 2. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.